Hello, everybody. I'm Jonathan Lips, and I work for a company called HeadSpin. And we are here today to talk about Appium 2. Appium 2 is something that I've talked about a lot in recent years. The main difference for this webinar is that Appium 2 is actually out. So it's out of beta. It's the only officially supported version of Appium, hopefully a version of Appium that some of you have been using for quite some time. But we're here to talk about what Appium 2 is, some of the highlights, and just celebrate the fact that it is finally released. So, yeah, this is me. I'm the kind of lead architect maintainer of the Appium project in the open source world. And at HeadSpin, I'm the director of automation technologies. Um, if you're not familiar with HeadSpin, HeadSpin is performance slash user experience testing service provider or a cloud service. We offer devices for testing and for investigating all kinds of performance and usability issues. Appium has been supported as a primary way of kicking off your functional and performance tests on HeadSpin and running those tests on HeadSpin for a very long time. And not to steal my thunder from later, but Appium 2 is already up and running, working well on HeadSpin. So I've been at HeadSpin for a number of years, and my job at HeadSpin is to make sure that the different ways people try and do automation on our platform are working well. So one of those ways is Appium. So that's how these different parts of my job come together happily. All right. So Appium 2 is out as of last Wednesday, I think. So it's basically been a full week. How long was Appium 2 in development? Well, I went and looked at the Git log, and according to the first uh, Git commit for Appium 2, um, this process has been going on for 3 years, 8 months, and 15 days. I guess that's not counting the time that it took to actually do the work for the first commit, which was probably several weeks. So we're looking at close to 4 years of work on Appium 2. During those 4 years, we've had 71 beta releases and more recently five release candidates. So Appium 2 has changed quite a bit over the period of those releases. And I guess my feelings throughout this process is summed up, somewhat by these emoji here. It's been a long process. It's been sometimes a frustrating process. I know that a lot of our users have been frustrated that Appium 2 didn't come out quicker. Um, but as is the case with many, many open source projects that are of a sufficient size and have people basically volunteering their time to work on it, um, there's not really a sort of official project or product management process. A lot of ad hoc work, a lot of things coming up, a lot of switching directions and making choices based on feedback. And that's part of the beautiful thing about working on open source. Actually, as we get to have users trying out very early betas of Appium 2 and giving us feedback and all that. So it's been a long process. I'm very happy that Appium 2 is now finally out. Um, I thought it would be fun to actually take a look at what the first commit for Appium 2 was. This was published on October 20th, 2019, so this is a long time ago. And this commit added the first version of the Appium driver command line interface. So the new CLI tool that's a part of Appium that allows you to look at which drivers are available, install drivers and uninstall drivers and stuff like that. Basically a wrapper for NPM and some other tools to help manage your Appium drivers and ultimately plugins, although plugins didn't exist at the time of this commit. So this was the first batch of work that was committed to Appium 2, and this was almost 4 years ago. Pretty wild. The first beta came out quite a bit after that, actually. It looks like about 6 months after that. So we continued to do some work on getting Appium 2 usable, and we launched that first beta just about 3 years ago. So Appium 2 was in beta for about 3 years. Although if you've been familiar with the project at all, you'll know that despite having the beta tag, we've actually recommended people use Appium 2 in production for like the last year or more. We stopped supporting Appium 1 a while back because it was impossible to support two really divergent streams of the product. And Appium 2 was really only in beta because of a lot of tweaks and sort of documentation work that was yet to be done, which I'll talk about in a bit. So that is a little bit of trivia about the development process. But let's take a step back and talk about Appium 2 itself. What was the vision of Appium 2? In some sense, because we weren't really strictly following semantic versioning, the difference between Appium 1 and 2 is more of a promotional or marketing kind of reason. It was all around what is our big idea for Appium that we want to say, like, this is what we're putting out into the world as Appium 2. And that big idea was basically WebDriver compatible automation for everything. So if Appium 1 was really focused on mobile automation and kind of proving that we can take this WebDriver automation standard to some new platforms, the vision for Appium 2 was, well, let's just extend that to everything, any platform, any type of application. It's kind of complete the work of WebDriver in the world. And that necessitated a lot of changes in Appium because the way that Appium had been developed up until that time, wasn't designed with those goals in mind. So what were the goals for Appium 2? We could think of it in terms of problems that Appium 2 is trying to solve. The first problem for this big vision that we have is that there's a lot of platforms. When you talk about WebDriver compatible automation for everything, you now are adding a lot of platforms on top of iOS and Android. We're talking about web, we're talking about TV, smart TV devices. We're talking about, potentially smart appliances and Internet of Things devices. And, the list keeps getting bigger and bigger the more we roll on into the future. Now things like AR and VR, especially with Apple's recent announcements this summer, are going to be targets for test automation sooner rather than later. So there was no way that our small team of volunteers could support and maintain support for all of these different platforms for automation, even if we had a way to integrate these into Appium. And so for Appium 2, we felt it was necessary to open up the possibility for other people to maintain support for platform automation in an Appium compatible way. And so our idea with Appium 2 was that we wanted not just drivers that the Appium team maintained, but we wanted a whole ecosystem where anybody, regardless of whether they know the core team or not, can write and share Appium drivers for other platforms. And it kind of spreads out the responsibility for maintenance and for R&D and all these things into the places where there is expertise on these different platforms. There's no way for the Appium team of 4 people or whatever to be experts in iOS and Android and Vision OS or all of these different platforms. But there are people who are experts in those things out there, and so we wanted to make it easy for them to maintain Appium drivers that make it possible to automate those platforms and make it easy for them to share those with the world as well. Um, Another problem that we had noticed over the years is that people had a lot of different ideas for how to use Appium in kind of non-basic, non-standard use cases, integrating it with other tools. I mean, a good example was image-based automation, right? So instead of using UI elements that are provided by the system test frameworks or the accessibility layer of a platform, there's the idea of, well, what about just looking at the screen and seeing where things are on the screen and performing image reference checks or matching two screenshots to see if they're the same. These are, valuable aspects of test automation a lot of the time. And so, we built a series of features around that, but it was sort of separate from our core set of features. And so we were building a lot of things like this, or other people had ideas for these kinds of extensions to Appium's behavior. And so what we decided to do with Appium 2 was create a plugin ecosystem where, again, we kind of give the keys to Appium to anybody, and say, you have an idea for some way that you want Appium to work, some way that you want Appium to integrate with some other piece of software, um, some cool idea you have, like the image analysis features. Well, you can do that, and you can integrate it into Appium, and you can share that work with the world. And not only the core team now has the ability to write new features for Appium. So this plugin ecosystem is pretty awesome because it enables anybody out there who can write code the option of creating new features or new behaviors for Appium, and then share that with anyone else in the world, or sell that to anyone else in the world. We definitely hope that at some point the driver and plugin ecosystem is valuable enough, that people are finding ways to make money on this as well. That's all part of what we view as a healthy ecosystem, hoping that, of course, much of the work remains free and open source, because that is obviously the spirit of Appium as well. Another big problem was that it was very difficult to keep our documentation in sync with the actual code behavior. And we had all these different platforms that wanted to kind of evolve in their own ways. And it was very tricky for us to maintain that. So we needed a new documentation architecture, a whole new documentation framework, not to mention updating of various actual bits of content that were outdated or needed updating. And of course, over the, I don't know how many, 6, 7 years of Appium's existence before Appium 2 work began, there was a lot of cruft that had developed, a lot of early architectural decisions that needed, updating or rethinking, incompatible code, old code that was no longer used. So there was a lot of cleanup that we wanted to do as part of the move to Appium 2 as well. So these were kind of the goals that we set out to accomplish with Appium 2, and these are the things that we have done. It's also worth talking about what some of the specific non-goals were, because when we talked about Appium 2, people kept on asking, well, how, are you going to make this change to the iOS driver, or this other change to your Android drivers, or, are there going to be breaking changes in the Espresso driver and things like that? And so one point that we had to make a lot was that platform-specific updates were a non-goal for Appium 2, an explicit non-goal. We wanted, part of the goal of Appium 2 is to make it so that the XUI test driver, the Android driver, whatever, can follow their own path of development. They no longer need to be so tightly bound to the Appium server. They don't need to have features or work that bleeds over into unrelated drivers. And so those drivers continued their own development trajectories in parallel. And over the last, you know, 4 years of Appium 2's development, there have been a lot of changes in those drivers, but those were not related to Appium 2 from a user-facing perspective. So it's true that now Appium's core drivers, like the XUI test driver and the Android driver, now are only compatible with Appium 2, but that's kind of for technical reasons, not because we have made some huge updates to the drivers that have changed the way that they work fundamentally. They're still the same basic drivers, and they continue to evolve and will continue to evolve. And you'll need Appium 2 to use them. But one of the great things about Appium 2 is that with this new driver ecosystem, the drivers can follow their own development trajectories and their own development processes and their own release processes and things like that. So you can have Appium 2.0 and you can keep updating the XUI test driver every day as new releases come out. And you can keep your UI Automator 2 driver at the same version that works for you if you want. And these things can now vary independently of one another, which is really useful for people doing this automation as their daily work. Okay, so what are some of the major new features? We already talked a little bit about the driver ecosystem. And I was just making this point already. Drivers can now follow independent development. So with Appium 1, we would have to make a release of Appium 1, and it would bring in whatever the most recent version of all the drivers were. But what if you didn't want those particular versions? What if you wanted one version of one driver and one version of another driver? You'd have to go in and do some surgery on the NPM packages, and it's pretty messy. So now this is a fully supported situation here where each driver is kind of released and updated on its own. And third parties, such as yourselves, can create and distribute drivers easily. So I'll give some examples later of how my team at HeadSpin has been creating some new Appium 2 drivers that are not part of what the Appium core team is involved in. I mean, I'm involved in these projects, but that's kind of accidental, so to speak. These are drivers that HeadSpin is supporting. They're open source. They're out there for anyone to use. They're not part of the official Appium project in any way. So it's pretty great to be able to do this kind of work, to have HeadSpin say, at HeadSpin, we value creating these smart TV drivers, and we're going to support them and put them out in the world. And some other company might value creating a VR driver or an IoT driver because that's their area of expertise, and they'll put that out there in the world and maintain it and build a community of practitioners around that platform. The plugin ecosystem. There's really very little limit to what plugins can do with Appium. They can add new features, they can integrate with other software, they can change the way that commands are implemented, they can change the types of services that are hosted on the Appium server. You can add a web server to the Appium server that shows you a website that gives you lots of details about what's happening, or shows you which devices are connected. There's some pretty cool plugins that have already been created, which I'll point out in a little bit. And again, plugins can be created by anybody, not just the Appium core team, and distributed in the same way as drivers and made easily consumable by the Appium community. And of course, plugins can be combined. This can be a bit dangerous because you never know if one plugin is doing something which could interfere with something another plugin is doing. So part of the trade-off we made with plugins is that we wanted plugins to be sort of maximally powerful, but that meant that there's no guarantee that plugins won't step on each other's toes. So you do have to be a bit careful when you're using, two plugins to make sure that they're not trying to both, override the same command or do so in a way which is incompatible with what the other is doing. But by and large, plugins are designed to do different things from one another, and so they can be fruitfully combined. So for example, I have a plugin that enables automation of Unity Unity-based games. And this plugin could be combined with the image analysis plugin quite easily. So they stack together really well. So you do have to put a little bit of thought into the plugins that you're using to make sure that conceptually they're compatible with one another. But you can create this very uh, powerful stack of plugins by combining little bits of functionality that various people have created and put into the community. A little basic how-to in terms of getting started with Appium 2, assuming some familiarity already with Appium. Installing it is the same as before. Appium's a node-based project, so you install it with npm. If you have Appium 1 already, probably want to uninstall that first, get rid of everything. But you just npm install -g Appium, and that will put the Appium executable link on your system. One of the main differences is that drivers don't come installed with Appium 2 by default because we don't know what platforms you want to automate, and we want Appium itself to be a lightweight server, and then you can just specify which drivers you want to use with Appium. So the two most common drivers nowadays are the XUI test driver for iOS and the UI Automator 2 driver for Android. So there's a whole new extension command line interface that lets you manage drivers and plugins using commands like the one you see here. One other change, I guess, for Appium 2 is that we now require WebDriver W3C specification compliant capabilities. So you'll see that there's an Appium colon prefix in front of some of these example capabilities here, like Appium colon device name or Appium colon automation name. That Appium colon is called a vendor prefix, and that's just a required feature of the WebDriver protocol. It's designed to allow extensibility in capabilities and kind of name spacing of capabilities. So most of the Appium clients will do this for you automatically, but if you're using a client like WebDriver IO, for example, which doesn't, then you'll just need to update your capabilities to make sure that the non-standard capabilities, the non-official WebDriver capabilities, have a vendor prefix. You might want some plugins. So there's an officially maintained images plugin, which has been broken out from our image-related functionality from Appium 1. So this is now a plugin, so that people who don't need that functionality don't have to go installing native extensions and things that are required for that plugin. There's also some cool third-party plugins out there. One from some of the other Appium contributors that they've made on their own. The device farm plugin. There's like a test management plugin. There's a bunch of interesting things out there that you can search for. That's basically it. There's really not a whole lot that you need to worry about in terms of upgrading from Appium 1 to Appium 2, but we do have a very extensive and exhaustive guide to migrating, and this is at our new documentation site. So if you just go to appium.io and look in the guides, you'll find the migration guide there, which is, as I said, totally comprehensive. It should answer any question you have in terms of migrating from Appium 1. Or if it doesn't, let us know. We are making, small tweaks to the migration guide as we get feedback from people who are now doing this migration. Okay. A couple other notes about, what's going on in the Appium ecosystem related to Appium 2. One is that you should definitely be using Appium Inspector instead of the old Appium Desktop tool. There is an older piece of software called Appium Desktop, which combined an Appium server in a graphical interface with an inspecting tool that enabled you to look at UI elements and perform actions and things like that. With Appium 2, we made the decision to kind of kill off the graphical server. That kind of worked when Appium was one bundled package with all the drivers and things combined in it. But now in this new world with drivers and plugins, it became a little bit too onerous to think about all the things that we would need to add to that graphical tool, plus all the ways that things might not work very well. And so we decided to stop maintaining that and instead just require that anyone who's using Appium just runs Appium from the command line. It's not very difficult to do. It's just running the phrase Appium in your terminal. And that's just going to be a lot easier for people at the end of the day to maintain their drivers and plugins and to start the server and to read the logs and stuff. So run Appium in your terminal. That's how you start the Appium server. But then we now have a separate app called Appium Inspector, which has seen a lot of updates in the last few years. And so it's a much improved inspection experience. And it's actually, possible to run it from a web browser now. So there's a hosted version of the inspector up at inspector.appiumpro.com. So you don't even need to download anything to use the inspector now. You can just run it right from your website. The Appium Inspector is actually bundled into the HeadSpin user interface. So if you're a HeadSpin user, you can just find a device and start an Appium inspection on it, an Appium inspection session on it directly. So right from your browser. So it's all pretty awesome. There's been a lot of cool things that have happened. Just a brief tour of some of the new features from the inspector. There is now a gestures editor or a gesture builder that enables you to kind of construct potentially complex multi-touch gestures. This gesture that I'm showing here is a simple kind of scroll action, but you can create actions like pinch and zoom or rotate or whatever, and you can save those gestures and then replay them on the same app or different apps. So it's just a really useful way of manually performing complex actions that you might not even be able to perform on a simulator with your mouse, right? Things that you might actually have to use fingers to do otherwise. That's one really cool feature which we added last summer, I think. And then another kind of advanced feature is what we call element handles. So one problem with inspecting any UI is that often elements are stuck on top of each other, or the center points of certain elements overlap. And so simply by mousing over an element, it might not be sufficient to find the particular element you're interested in. Or there might be, like a bunch of container elements, and you want one of these container elements, but all that you can find by simply mousing over an element would be, let's say, the leaf element or something like that. So with our element handles feature, you can actually get a view of all of the elements that are available for selection on top of the screenshot. And when elements have centers that overlap, you can click the little plus button and then cycle through which of those elements you actually want to select. So this enables much more fine-grained selection of elements without having to necessarily click through the source XML to do that. And this is obviously a pretty busy feature visually, so you can turn it on and off. If the kind of default element selection feature works fine for you, you don't need to use this, but there are some applications where you just couldn't tap onto the element you want without finding it manually in the XML source. And this is a much more streamlined experience. And it just kind of visually tells you more about what elements there are in your application, which is pretty cool. There's a bunch of other work that's been done on the inspector, so I recommend trying that out. There is actually a great amount of support for it in terms of maintenance and community help right now. So Inspector is one of, I think, the best tools in the Appium ecosystem. I certainly wouldn't be able to write any Appium tests without the Inspector. Can't imagine, can't you know? I guess I remember what it was like before the Inspector because I was there, but this is a lot, makes everything a lot easier. So definitely key tool that you'll want to keep up to date with. There are some new platform drivers, so kind of starting to um, meet this goal or vision of WebDriver compatible, Appium compatible automation for everything. Here's some of the new drivers that have been developed over the course of working on Appium 2. There's a Roku TV driver that has been produced by my team at HeadSpin, a Tizen TV driver, also produced by my team at HeadSpin, and yet another TV driver, this time for LG WebOS TVs. These are all open source, available on our HeadSpin GitHub, so you can check those out. We also made a Chromium driver in case you just wanted to automate the Chrome browser or a Chromium-based browser, like including I think the new is the new Edge Chromium-based. I can't remember. Anyway, there are a number of Chromium-based browsers that are automatable via Chrome driver. So the Appium Chromium driver is a basic wrapper for that. And more platform support to come, both by the core team, HeadSpin, and hopefully others out there who know about these up and coming platforms. Then there are some plugins I'll give some examples of that you can use today. One is the images plugin, which I already talked about. It lives in the Appium mono repo. There's also an execute driver script plugin, which was formerly part of the Appium One server, but again was such a different sort of feature. We broke it out into its own plugin for a number of reasons. But it's a pretty cool kind of meta feature almost. It lets you write entire scripts, essentially, send them to the Appium server and have them all executed locally without the need for back and forth HTTP requests, which are normally the way that WebDriver protocol commands work. So it can speed up test execution or make it less variable when you have time-sensitive actions because they're typically located much closer to where the device is. Anyway, it's a cool feature. You can check it out. I already mentioned this Unity game plugin that I wrote that is also hosted by my team at HeadSpin. This lets you work with the Alt Unity framework for Unity apps to give you kind of automation hooks directly into your game objects. So I've got some pretty cool demos of this. You can, I think, check it out at the plugin page. Was able to actually automate sort of a platform game, which would normally not be possible with Appium without this kind of deeper connection into the Unity game engine itself. And then some of our Appium friends have created a device farm plugin, which is kind of interesting, as well as an OCR plugin that I created as sort of a demo of how you could find objects on a screen simply by their text, and then use optical character recognition to figure out where those items are on a screen and to tap them. So it's similar to the images plugin, but related to finding text versus finding images that look a certain way or that match a certain other image. One of our big priorities for Appium 2 was again updating the documentation, and not just our documentation but our whole documentation architecture. And this means that as a user, you now need to kind of think about what it is that you're looking for when you have questions about Appium, and go to one of a couple different places potentially to get the answers that you need. So this is a helpful little chart here. If you want to learn about Appium as a whole, read about what Appium is and what Appium clients are and what Appium drivers are and how to build Appium drivers, go to the Appium docs. That's where that information will be. If If you want to know what are the server arguments, like what command line arguments can I pass to the Appium server to make it do different things, like load plugins or run on a different port or whatever. Or if you want to know how to use the new extension CLI, Appium driver install or Appium plugin update or whatever, that's all part of the Appium docs at appium.io. If you want to see what drivers and plugins are available, which ones we've kind of linked to, again, that is at appium.io. That's kind of all that's at appium.io, is this kind of high level overview of Appium and guides to conceptual guides to Appium, and then specific references about the Appium server itself. But if you want platform specific information, if you want to know, how do I install the XCUI test driver? What system requirements are there? How do I use the XCUI test driver? You now have to go to the documentation for that particular driver, because that's where that driver is being developed. Those are the people and the code that are related to that driver, and that's where the documentation will live. If you want to see what commands are available, what execute script commands are available, what can I do on this platform with this driver, then go to the documentation for that driver. Don't go to appium.io anymore. Or to see what capabilities are available. There's often a lot of ways to parameterize your automation session using capabilities, and those will again be listed at the driver specific documentation. And again, this enables drivers to develop independently and in a way that's best for them without having to try and shoehorn all the different things that all the different drivers are doing into one kind of massive and probably very confusing set of documentation. So let me just give you a brief tour of the Appium documentation. So here it is. This is the current docs for Appium 2.0. So again, there's a lot of really interesting stuff here. There's some nice conceptual introductions to Appium. There's a quick start for getting started with Appium for JavaScript, Python, Java, or Ruby using the UI Automator 2 driver, because it's kind of a very cross-platform driver. There's references for server command line arguments. So this is where you will go if you need to figure out, how do I make sure that my log messages have timestamps or whatever. Here's the log timestamp server argument. Or information about the extension CLI. So the list command, the install command, etc., etc. Even a bunch of helpful prose guides like the migration guide I mentioned earlier, how you manage drivers and plugins, the Appium configuration file, which is a useful alternative to command line flags that you can store in code, discussions about keeping your Appium server secure, discussions about the Appium settings API, which different drivers can implement, and so on and so forth. Another really important page here is the Appium ecosystem page, which talks about the various drivers that we know about and the various clients that we know about, the various plugins that we know about. So this is a good way to get to the XCUI test driver, for example. So if we go here to the XCUI test driver repo, we'll see that it has its own documentation, which was built using the same docs framework as Appium itself, and so it has a similar look and feel, which is pretty fun. And now I can do things like say, well, what are the capabilities that I can use for the XCUI test driver? And I can go here and scroll through the what seem like hundreds of capabilities. And I can even look at an automatically generated command reference, which is generated from the code base itself, and so we'll always be in sync with the current, version that's published, the current reality of the XCUI test driver. So if I want to say, what are the different execute methods? Oh, I have a deep link method here. This tells me the parameters that I should use and what type of response I should expect. So anytime you have questions about the XCUI test driver, this is where you go. If you have questions about the UI Automator 2 driver, you go to the documentation for that driver. as well. So that is our new documentation. It looks simple and usable, but let me tell you, it has been a lot of work to get this all up and running. A lot of work from a lot of people. So hopefully it is set up and a good framework for us for years to come. It can just stay up to date and be a much better uh, set of references for Appium users. Okay, finally, let's talk about Appium 2 on HeadSpin. And as I said before, yep, HeadSpin supports Appium 2 fully. It supported it from, you know, almost day one of the beta as well. So if you are a HeadSpin user, you've had access to Appium 2 for some time. But let me just talk about a little bit of what you need to do to get it working on HeadSpin. Right now, you need to use the HeadSpin Appium version capability. That's because our current default version of Appium is still 1 dot something in order to not have, you know, broken everyone's scripts without them knowing. So you need to opt in right now to Appium 2 using the Appium version capability. You now need the Appium automation name capability as a requirement. This is a requirement for Appium itself now too. So this isn't something that's kind of unique to HeadSpin, but you know, Appium now needs to know what driver you want to use. It can't infer it anymore from other capabilities because there might be multiple drivers for the same platform in the future. So you need to tell Appium explicitly which driver you want to use so it can make sure that it's been installed and that it supports the platform that you're specifying, and so on. And then also, if you want to use any plugins for your Appium session, you can do that with the HeadSpin Appium plugins capability. You can just send in an array of plugin names. And we have a whole migration guide specifically for, I'll just show this, I guess, specifically for HeadSpin. It's pretty small. There's really not much to do to update from Appium 1 to Appium 2 on HeadSpin, and this is largely because HeadSpin hosts the Appium server and drivers and plugins for you, so you don't have to do anything to manage that. So this is a useful guide for moving to Appium 2 on HeadSpin as well. And with that, I am done with my presentation. So thank you for celebrating Appium 2's launch with me. And I think it's now a good time to start answering some questions. So I've got a lot here in the Q&A tab, so let me try and read some of these. Okay, from Emil, we've got a question. Do existing XPath and XCUI test selectors work as is after the transition? The answer to that is yes, because you know, changing the way that the XCUI test driver worked was a non-goal for Appium 2. So we didn't change anything about the XCUI test driver as part of Appium 2 work. Now, over the last 4 years, the XCUI test driver has changed a lot, but that's kind of unrelated to Appium 2 work. So, you know, depends on how old your version of the XCUI test driver is, the last one that you've been using. But if you've been using relatively current ones, then yeah, there will be no changes there. Our Arcana or Archana asked, can we automate Flutter's a Flutter build APK using Appium 2.0? And the answer to that is if there's a good Flutter driver for Appium 2.0, there is a Flutter driver. I don't know if it's good or how well it works, but I believe it's linked in the Appium documentation on the ecosystem page that I showed before. You can try out that Flutter driver. The Appium core team doesn't maintain the Flutter driver, so we don't really support it. Don't really know much about it, but I do know that there is a driver, so I would say try that. Let's see, from Kirk, what does the future Appium roadmap look like? And kind of home in on existing challenges, potential inclusion of AI, data resiliency, etc. It's an interesting question. I think in one way of looking at it, Appium 2 is kind of the end of history for Appium in that it wanted to kind of give the building blocks of the future to the community and to make sure that we built a sort of future-proof architecture. Um, so in terms of our platform support, our goals are to continue to support, iOS and Android primarily uh, on the core team. So we'll continue to do that. There's always work, a lot of work right now, for example, with iOS 17, trying to figure out how to make it compatible with Appium because Apple broke a lot of stuff. So that's the kind of thing that's on the roadmap. But ideally, other experts in different platforms would step forward and start to, maintain Appium support for those other platforms. And then as industries evolve and change, that the Appium would continue to, be a viable architecture for people to build automation support on. That's kind of our vision. In terms of AI to add resiliency, I think, yeah, like an AI like selector self-healing tool would be a great Appium plugin. I don't know, maybe I'll mess around with that someday, or maybe one of these companies that's already developed those technologies will contribute an Appium plugin to that effect. I think that would be cool. That's again part of why we wanted to create the possibility for this ecosystem is because there's so many ideas for how Appium could be augmented um, in really cool ways. But our core team of 3 to 4 volunteers can't say we're gonna go build a bunch of AI stuff because like we just have to keep the lights on. So hopefully other people who have these ideas will now have the tools to be able to build them and maintain them, and we want to support that. Um, let's see. Raja asks about support for audio and video validation. Um, yeah, there's not really anything that we have explicit support for in iOS or Android because Apple and Google don't give us really great tools for audio and video validation. I think I wrote an Appium Pro article one time on how to get audio from a device as part of your test and how to match that against some other audio if what you're trying to do is validate that the audio stream was similar um, to something pre-recorded. That kind of thing is possible. That's not really part of Appium itself. HeadSpin provides a lot of audio and video related analysis tools. Um, so that's something that, you know, cloud providers might provide on top of Appium. Um, so again, this could be a really interesting plugin. Somebody that really knows how to do audio fingerprinting, for example, could create an Appium plugin that does for audio what we already have for images, and same for video. So I'm afraid this is probably going to be my category of answer for a lot of these questions is sounds like a great plugin. I hope somebody does that. um, Mikon, your question about advantages and disadvantages of different infrastructure is a little bit too big for me to try and answer right here. A good question though. I think I've probably have some stuff written about this somewhere. Um, find some other questions. When is this presentation recording going to be shared? Yes, I believe so. We'll make it available, so don't worry about that. Best place to search for available plugins right now, the Appium ecosystem page on the documentation. This question comes from Raz. Hey, Raz. Um, I think, yeah, maybe you typed this question before I showed you the list. Any plugins that we know about that seem useful and good, we'll put there. We're not going to obviously vet every plugin from security or a code viability perspective. So third-party plugins are always used at your own risk. But yeah, if you are created a plugin, let us know. Or just actually just raise a PR to our documentation to add your plugin to the list. Devendran asked, can we upgrade from beta to 2.0 official by providing, I guess, the npm install command? Yeah, that's right. To get Appium 2, you don't need to do anything special. If you already had the beta, just install the official one over top of the other one. That's it. Um, let's see. Manuel asks, is there a way to run Android Auto or Apple CarPlay sessions using Appium? Android Auto, I think is possible. I haven't done it myself, but I think I've heard of people doing it. Apple CarPlay, I don't think I've heard of anyone doing it. I feel like it's a different enough SDK. I don't know if XC Test even works on CarPlay. You might need a special test kit for that because it's not like you can just um, go be a car manufacturer. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know about Apple CarPlay. My hunch is that it doesn't just work already. But that would be again a cool driver for somebody to make. Let's see. Any plans to integrate Appium with generative tools? I feel like this means, is talking about like ChatGPT or generative AI tools. No plans. Again, could be a cool plugin if somebody, had some ideas about that. Like many of us, I've played around with ChatGPT trying to get it to generate Appium code. Looks looks largely good, but is fundamentally sometimes incorrect. I wouldn't recommend it necessarily. Um, if you want good Appium code. But there could be something interesting there in the future. Again, I don't know if it would be an Appium plugin or just something that someone in the Appium community creates, some kind of tool. Maybe there's some way for us to integrate generative AI into the Appium Inspector somehow. Not exactly sure how that would work or what the utility would be. Yeah, no current plans on that, Garasankar. Um, uh, Selfak asks, what are the dependencies needed to run Appium with the Espresso driver? I would check out the Espresso driver documentation to answer that question more specifically. But basically, the way that Espresso tests work is they get bundled up with your application. So you have to have your application code. You can't just have an APK, for example. Well, can you? Maybe you can. I don't know. It's a bit more tricky. I haven't used the Espresso driver myself in a little while. I continue to use the UI Automator 2 driver because it's just easy for what I do. Um, so yeah, check out the Espresso documentation there. It's not totally different. You do have to update your build, um, like Gradle file, and make sure that your dependencies and the dependencies for the Appium Espresso driver automation server are compatible. People run into some issues there, but it is generally possible. Okay. Ankur asks, what's the support for animation validation? I'd say there's no good support for validating animations. They typically happen very quickly, much more quickly than um, Appium is able to kind of figure out what's going on, and they're typically not represented in the UI source tree. They're kind of purely visual. So if you wanted to do animation validation, I would recommend, capturing a video and then doing some kind of video analysis on it. Not exactly sure, but yeah, there's nothing like officially supported in Appium for this for sure. All right. Why is it that Appium 2 is too slow on emulators? Appium 2 isn't any slower or faster probably than Appium 1. It works the same way. So if you feel like Appium 2 is slower than Appium 1, then please file an issue on our GitHub issue tracker with the details in a repro case, and we'll definitely look into it. Appium 2 should not be in any way slower than Appium 1. In some cases, it should hopefully be faster because it's a lighter weight piece of software than Appium 1 was. Okay, are other cloud device farm vendors like BrowserStack supporting Appium 2? I don't know. I don't work for BrowserStack. Um, so you'd have to ask them, I guess. Hopefully. Uh, Appium 2 has been the only supported version of Appium for over a year, so hopefully all the other cloud providers also support it. If not, go yell at them because what have they been doing? Hitesh asks, can we match color codes in Appium 2? There was no color code feature developed as part of Appium 2. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by matching color codes, but this could be a cool plugin that somebody could make. It could be something you could potentially accomplish with the images plugin currently. If you're just looking to make sure that some color is present somewhere on the screen, you could create a little square of that color as an image and check to see whether you can find that on the screen. Would be one thing I would do. I'm not exactly sure what the use case is here, but yeah, no particular support for color code matching. Jetpack Compose support. I believe Jetpack Compose support is supported in the Espresso driver. So if you want to use Jetpack Compose, you'll need to use the Espresso driver. Okay. Carl, hey Carl, how's it going? Good to see you on here. Glad you could join us. And yeah, look forward to hopefully you'll be writing some good stuff about Appium too. Carl's got a book coming out, everyone. Check it out. Thank you for coming. Raz again. Um, yeah. Oh, people are just saying congratulations, which I appreciate. It's it's been a lot of work. Yes, and you have been using Appium too for a long time. I remember that. So yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you for keeping faith in us through a lot of ups and downs of the Appium 2 story. Okay, let's keep, wow, questions keep coming in. Let's keep going. Ajay asks, can I enable or disable app-specific settings in Android mobile apps using JavaScript? Um, I would say you can use Appium to modify the settings in your apps the same way that a user would. So uh, probably that's the way you want to do it. If your app, if you want to do something quicker, create a shortcut in your app to enable setting a setting via an Android intent or something like that. Um, that would be the fastest way. But the typical Appium way of doing this would be to automate it using the UI, just like a user would. Getting errors while installing images plugin. Can't really do like support here on this webinar. I would uh, go ahead and ask a question in the forums or file an issue if you think you've got a bug report. So please redirect that one to GitHub, Arjana. Here's another one from Garasankar. Self-healing is an important feature which is currently not available in Appium. Do you have any plans to integrate or implement with Appium? I mean, I kind of alluded to this before. Um, no, self, no, we don't have any plans to integrate it with the main Appium server, but it could be an interesting plugin that somebody could create, right? Because for self-healing, you have to keep track of which selectors are used and which elements they target. And that sort of thing is just not part of Appium's responsibility as an automation tool. That's a kind of higher level. But yeah, you could build something like that as an Appium plugin. Maybe I'll do that someday. I don't know. I don't have any plans to. Um, but the good thing is that Appium is compatible because it's just an automation library with all of the other self-healing tools that already exist. So all these companies that provide self-healing probably do so on top of Appium in some way or another. So um, check all those tools out. Hey Dominic, thanks for your comment. You're very welcome. We're excited Raghunatha asks if image comparison is supported in Appium 2. Yes, just use the images plugin. It's all documented on the images plugin documentation. Hitesh asks, are swipes and gestures still supported out of the box? Yeah, using the W3C Actions API in your WebDriver client or Appium client, you can still, you know, um, construct any kind of arbitrary gesture using multiple fingers or whatever. Um, you have to construct those action steps. Will Appium 2 support swipe down till element is visible out of the box? Nope. That's never been a goal for us. That's something that you can create on your client side. It's something that could be an Appium plugin. Um, but I've written this function dozens of times. It's like maybe 10 lines of code. I usually just put it in my test framework. It's not hard to implement on your own. So yeah, I would recommend just implementing it on your own, or maybe writing a patch to the client, the Appium client that you use, to say, hey, why don't we include this as a helper function? But no, it's not. It's not ever going to be like a server side function unless we have some particular platform specific support for it. Like if XCUI test had a swipe till element is visible feature, then we would add something that mapped to that. And in fact, on iOS, if you find an element and try and tap on it, uh, the XC test generally will scroll to it for you anyway. So there is that. Okay, I think we're pretty much out of time. I think that was most of the questions. If I didn't answer your question, apologies, but we do have to let people get on to whatever they were doing next. For many of you, that might be sleep, if you're on a different part of the world than I am. But yeah, it's been a pleasure to celebrate the launch of Appium 2 with all of you, and start using it, start developing drivers and plugins, share them with the world, and yeah, let's keep making this community and this ecosystem awesome. It's been um, 11 years plus of no, I don't know, 10, 11 years of Appium, and looking forward to the next 10 or 11. Hopefully, you'll still be around then, as will I. All right, have a great evening, morning, appropriate time of day wherever you are, and we'll see you later. Bye.